We're going to talk about FDA regulatory oversight and inspection trends, how computers and data integrity play into that, what we mean by GXP systems, computer system validation, and the system development lifecycle methodology, GAMP5, computer system risk assessment, and then we'll get into some of the regulatory influences, response to change, and best practices. Finally, we'll recap and have a Q&A session. The FDA has predicate rules upon which everything is based. GXP is defined as good variable practice. GMPs are good manufacturing practices, GLPs are good laboratory practices, and GCPs are good clinical practices. All of the rules that relate to these have to be followed, whether you are just doing computer system validation or 21 CFR Part 11 electronic record and electronic signature compliance. You still have to rely on complying with the predicate rules. Now, the FDA operates on some very key premises. One is, if you didn't document something, you didn't do it. There's no chance that you can prove that you did something without the documentation. A second is, if you could have committed fraud, you did commit fraud. So, for example, if you have an analyst entering raw data into a system, and the system is not protected with an audit trail, and someone goes in and makes a change to it without recording the change information, such as the date, who made the change, why they made the change, and maintaining the original value, that's an opportunity to commit fraud. And that would be a gaping hole in your system functionality that FDA would find fault with. If you have data being collected on a system like that, they can invalidate all of that data. And the third is, if you didn't adhere to a policy or procedure that you had written for your organization, and you didn't document the fact that you did a deviation from that and had a good reason, then you are at fault as well. It's one thing to have policies and procedures in place that are up to date, current, and accurate. It's another to make sure that they're being followed. Now, with the regulatory oversight from FDA, there is no recourse if you do not have your documentation, for example, or if you could have committed fraud. The notion that you're innocent until proven guilty doesn't hold up when dealing with FDA. They can issue consequences, fines, they can confiscate your materials and products, and they can shut down your operations. A classic example of this happening was in 1998 when Schering-Plough, a pharmaceutical company, underwent a consent decree from FDA. It cost them $500 million in fines. It resulted in them having to shut down more than one of their manufacturing plants, and it took about 10 years for them to recover from all of those losses. Now, FDA has many tools available to them. They have the ability to hold regulatory meetings. They can issue an injunction, consent decrees, import alerts, seizures of products. They can issue warning letters and untitled letters. When we look at the Investigations Operation Manual 5.2.3, we see an observation made when, in the investigator's judgment, conditions or practices that are observed by the investigator indicate that there's been an adulteration of a device, a drug, a food, or a cosmetic. It's being prepared, packed, or held under conditions that could cause it to become adulterated or rendered injurious to the health of a consumer or patient. This would be an observation by FDA, a citation that they can issue. A warning letter is more severe. It's official correspondence. It goes to the highest ranking known official in the organization, typically the CEO. It identifies the serious violations of regulations. And all of this is published on the FDA website. It can be viewed by other agencies, businesses, consumers, and the media. So there can be a great deal of reputational harm and monetary harm as a result of this. The International Committee for Harmonization, Q7, represents FDA's current thinking on current good manufacturing practices for APIs. there are no current good manufacturing practices regulations for APIs. The FDA generally considers API manufacturing and testing facilities that follow ICHQ-7 to comply with statutory CGMPs, and alternate approaches may be used. 501A2B requirements can be met if your approach ensures that your API purported or represented purity, identity, and quality. So this is just a note about API manufacturing. The FDA issued the Safety and Innovation Act of 2012, FDA-Asia, signed into law July 9, 2012. It adds a component to the FD&C Act to deem adulterated a drug that's been manufactured, processed, packed, or held in a factory, a warehouse, or any establishment, and the owner, operator, or agent of that location delays entry, denies entry, limits an inspection by FDA, or simply refuses to permit entry or inspection. So this is another component that was added in 2012. CGMP violation can cause a drug quality defect or a medical device quality defect or any regulated product. This can cause potential adverse patient health consequences. And FDA is especially interested where there are repeat violations, significant data integrity violations, and delay or denial or refusal or limitation of FDA's inspection. When we look at the FDA inspection trends, we see that there are a lot of warning letters issued and cleared. There's also a number of import alerts. It should be noted that a majority of issued injunctions and import alerts, warning letters, untitled letters, a good amount of these are to international companies. And we see here that, again, warning letters are very heavy, import alerts. There are a lot of issues with the supply chain of organizations where counterfeit and contraband may come into the country, into the U.S. If that happens, there's an import alert. It may be something coming from another country that could potentially cause harm to patients or consumers in the U.S. And another slide on FDA inspection trends. Again, we see quite a number of sites that are given import alerts and traditional warning letters. Some of the more recent warning letter trends, and these are serious letters that come to the CEO, as I said before, they actually will state in them, and I have read these, that you, the CEO, will go to jail if these things are not remedied. Some of these are due, or a large portion are due, to data integrity issues. There may be a lack of control over access to computerized systems, system security. There may be non-contemporaneous record keeping, where people are not recording raw data as it happens. There could be deletion, falsification, alteration, or some other manipulation or fraudulent activity. And also the supply chain, API repackers and relabelers, contract manufacturers, the heparin supply chain. These are all areas of important concern to FDA. The supply chain in particular is important because counterfeit and contraband activity generates a lot of money, a lot of revenue, which goes most often to terrorist organizations around the world. It also, of course, hits the bottom line of U.S. companies. Now here's a trend on 483 citations. These are your typical observations that are given to a company during an FDA inspection or audit that's done on site. The 483 citations are much less of concern than warning letters. They're one step in the process. They're not as serious, of course, as a warning letter, but they can lead to that if there are repeat violations or if the violations are not remedied. In 2008 to 2012, we saw somewhat of an increase in these, mainly because at that time there were more resources in FDA. There's some tailing off in 2013. A lot of this has to do with the number of resources in FDA available to do inspections. It also depends on the length of time of the inspections and how detailed they are. So there are many factors that weigh into the number of citations and warning letters and such that are given. The same trend is seen with device inspection. We see an increase through 2012 and then some tailing off. There isn't any available data to show what kind of trend has occurred since 2013. Unfortunately, there isn't anything on the internet or the FDA website. But note that most of the recent warning letters relate to two very key areas. Data integrity, 19 is the value assigned to that, and rudimentary current good manufacturing practices, 20. So that's basically the predicate rules and data integrity issues. These are of critical importance, especially when you're dealing with computer systems. The 2015 warning letters show that the majority went to API finished pharmaceuticals. There were 21 letters issued. There were 6 sites that had import alerts. And data integrity issues were found at 13 sites. It might seem that FDA takes issue with data integrity problems at overseas firms in a disproportionate amount, but 80% of APIs are manufactured internationally, and 40% of FDFs are manufactured internationally. So you see that there is a trend in a lot of overseas production. FDA has to go after these types of organizations as well. Now, these are the areas that are at most risk during an inspection. Security and access to your computer system. Also, physical access to your building. Testing and validation of your system. Training and expertise. And that covers users of the system, the people who are maintaining the system in a validated state, and the people who actually do the validation work. Documentation is also an area of risk. A lot of these are unforced errors on the part of organizations. There's things that they could easily fix, but often there's oversight, overlooking something, and sloppy work habits. Now, with computer system security and access, a lot of companies lately seem to have more lax practices when it comes to security and access, which I find unusual. You would think in this day and age that those types of practices would become stronger. More frequently, they're coming across people sharing usernames, sharing passwords, sharing user accounts. There's no real good, strong security on electronic records and signatures. That's 21 CFR Part 11, the guidance on electronic records and signatures that must be met to be in compliance with FDA. And users are given more access than they need or that's appropriate for them. Access should be role-based, and a user should never have more access than required to do their role. Change control and audit trails are another area that can be easily compromised. They may not exist. They may not have processes or procedures in place to allow for good change control management. Or they may not have audit trails in their systems. Or they could have audit trails that could easily be deleted or turned off. Segregation of duties is also something that is not always clear. I've heard many people from organizations complain that they don't have enough people to have proper segregation of duty, but that's not an excuse for it. With computer system testing and validation, a lot of companies have been found to lack good validation for their computer systems that are subject to GXPs. or maybe insufficient validation. Validation documentation lacking. The testing process insufficient. They don't challenge the system in terms of negative scenarios. So for example, you don't want to just challenge the system to make sure that it does what it's supposed to do, that every functional requirement works. You also need to challenge that it doesn't do what you don't want it to do. Much more thorough testing is required. And also, boundaries and stresses need to be challenged. Not all companies use requirements traceability. A requirements traceability matrix links your requirements to your design elements and testing elements. Every single requirement must be unique and testable, and there must be at least one test script, if not more, associated with every requirement. One of the FDA's statements in their early guidance in 1983, their Blue Book, which was an initial guidance on computerized systems, stated that basically and very simply, a system must be proven to do what it purports to do. So you need to make sure you have a good set of solid requirements and that you test every single one of them thoroughly and successfully. Standard operating procedures are another area. This is an often overlooked area where people don't always use the most current version of an SOP. SOPs should have a statement at the bottom so that if they are printed, the statement should say that this is only valid for 24 hours, for example. So if someone wants to print something for reference today, you don't want them referring to that same SOP 6 months from now if it's been out of date. All of these things can lead to FDA findings. Training and expertise is also critical. Everyone in your organization involved in computer system validation and use should have a resume or CV on file. The resumes or CVs should reflect the type of training and expertise they have to do the role that they've been assigned to do. Training sometimes is not mandatory, or if mandatory, the requirement isn't enforced. I came across one company that had mandatory training and only 62% of the users attended the training. Internal staff may not be fully trained in the support of the system. They may rely also on a third-party contractor to maintain a system. In that case, if this contractor is not on site full-time, and that person is definitely not the entity responsible for the functioning of the system and maintenance of it in a validated state, you're left holding the bag. So be careful about who you assign to maintain your system once it's validated. It must be maintained for its entire life in a state of validation. And of course, you must have the documentation to prove that. Now, there are many cases that I've come across as well where users who didn't attend the training or just don't like the new system continue to use what I refer to as shadow systems. These are the systems that they were using prior to system implementation. Maybe Excel spreadsheets or Word documents or some form of recording information. If they're maintaining a shadow system along with the new system, there's a lot of confusion as to which is the system of record. Where are decisions made from? Which data record? Internal auditors may not be fluent in the validation process or in the functioning of your GXP systems, so they can't serve the organization effectively. Most companies I've been to have internal audit function within the quality organization, but not all of them look at computer system validation. Training records, CDs not maintained as current or don't reflect the skills and expertise required by the person to do their role. These are all findings that could easily be avoided. Now, with documentation, there's an endless list of documentation that could be missing. There's so much documentation associated with the whole system development life cycle methodology. methodology for computer system validation, and then maintaining it throughout the life. Perhaps a company didn't do a risk assessment. In the last 10 or 15 years, the FDA has focused on risk assessment because they didn't have enough auditors to evaluate or inspect every single system at every single company. They asked the industry, or the regulated industries, to come back and have a complete inventory of GXP systems, for which they've done a risk assessment on each system based on what would happen if the system failed. Would it affect a process, a product, or a patient, consumer? Based on the risk associated with the potential failure of a system, you can determine the relativity of the risk, how it relates to the risk associated with every other system, and prioritize those systems in your inventory. FDA will often ask for that inventory of prioritized risk GXP systems. That's something that should be on hand if you're going to be inspected. Insufficient testing documentation. Perhaps people are sloppy with their filling out of test protocols when they're executing testing. They may skip over something and not remember to go back to it, or may do something out of order. May put an incorrect date somewhere, incorrect information, or may forget to record their deviations in a deviation log and resolve them before putting this in production. These are just some of the errors that can happen. And generally not following GXP requirements for documentation of CSV activities, not properly using the blue or black ballpoint ink permanent marking, not using any kind of single line through your error to show you still can see and not obscure the original result, clearly writing in the correct one, and then initialing and dating, and along with that, writing the reason for the correction. All of that needs to be in place for corrections, and it is not always followed. There may be obscured data, there may be whiteout or erasures. All of these things are out of compliance. And again, incomplete or inadequate training records. So perhaps people went to training, but you didn't have a training log where people signed their name at the end to say that they were trained in that subject matter. Sterility assurance is also another area. Compounding and conventional, aseptic technique, EM design, rudimentary CGMPs, release testing, cleaning, equipment maintenance, basic sanitation, cross-contamination risks. More often for non-application OTC monograph drugs, over-the-counter. All of these things are things that generally rely on computer systems to document. You are generally going to have very strong presence of computers, systems that are collecting data, maintaining it, analyzing, reporting. And all of these systems in these areas must be validated, and if not, any one of these activities can be contaminated, so to speak. And then delay, deny, limit, refuse, where companies will do something to obstruct FDA when they attempt to come in for an inspection or audit. And these are some of the contributing factors to some of these, especially unforced errors. Regulatory maturity, and that's for both regulators and inspected firms. The FDA inspectors coming in may not fully understand computer system validation or compliance, and may not have good understanding and knowledge of the types of activities that are going on and the types of systems being used to collect data and analyze and report on it. The investigator background and expertise, they may be fairly new or inexperienced in a particular area of industry. The company culture and management oversight. Perhaps your company is not providing the leadership needed and creating the culture of compliance. And then prior history and relationship with the FDA office and inspectors. That's often a sore point. There are many companies that have an adversarial relationship with their local office, and that's not recommended. FDA should be your, and I would put this in quotes, your friend. Geographic location of inspected firms is also an issue. I can remember one drug company that located its toxicology labs in a very remote rural area of the U.S., and it did so intentionally because the local FDA inspectors basically were doing inspections of bakeries and things that were unrelated to the type of work they were doing. So they were way in over their heads in terms of being able to pick up any findings on audits. The availability of required expertise. Again, someone may not have all the types of expertise needed to do a real good, thorough investigation. And public information related to safety and efficacy is also something that tends to have an impact on how inspections are done. But remember that the requirements for record retention and review don't differ by data format, whether it's paper-based or electronic. The same requirements hold true, and these same requirements have not changed. Now let's talk about the computers and data integrity, one of the serious areas where FDA finds quite a number of inspection findings. The computer systems and the associated data, this is whether the data is paper or electronic, are essential to industry. These are used to make decisions, make assumptions on product quality and compliance. And violations can have a very serious negative safety, efficacy, or quality effect on a product and ultimately on the consumer or patient. So computer systems and the data are at the core of allowing a company to deliver safe and effective drugs and products to consumers. And note that right now the incidence of computer system and data integrity violations is considered by FDA to be at an all-time high. Again, most of these types of violations are unforced errors. Since 2010, one of the trends seen is that the FDA has issued warning letters to an increasing number of companies based on data integrity violations. So you can see how much it's risen just in the last few years. Part of that is because the investigators are becoming more adept at looking at computer systems and validation. So what is data integrity? Requirements for complete, consistent, and accurate data. It underpins the CGMPs, and it applies to CGMP and good clinical practice through ICH E6. Data should also be what we term ALCOA, A-L-C-O-A. Attributable, meaning that someone is responsible for that data, for creating it, or changing it, or reviewing it, or proving it. It must be legible. It must be written down or recorded in a computer contemporaneous to the action that is being documented. Your data also must be an original or true copy, and all of it must be accurate. All of these things are necessary for data to be assumed to have integrity. Data integrity problems are important because they break trust. We rely largely on trusting a firm to do the right thing when they're not being inspected or looked at. Data integrity problems break that trust. And data integrity and compliance with CGMP guidance for industry, April 2016, states 21 CFR Parts 11 to 12. The requirements that relate to data integrity mean that you must have backup data that's exact and complete. It must be secure from any type of alteration, inadvertent erasure, or loss. And data must be stored to prevent deterioration or loss. This applies, again, to both paper records and electronic records. And these next few sets show that activities must be documented at the time of performance. Laboratory controls have to be scientifically sound. Records have to be retained as original records or true copies or other accurate reproductions of original records. All of that must be explained. And it must be complete information, complete data derived from all testing, complete records of all data, and records of all tests performed. You can't run tests, for example, in a laboratory and pick and choose which set of data you're going to allow to be recorded as the real data. And again, these requirements are not new. These go back to the predicate rules. Now, these are some of the questions that might be asked during an inspection or that an inspector might be considering. It should be determined that the software and hardware is suitable to perform the particular task. Incidents should be recorded and investigated that are related to computer systems if there's a potential that they could affect reliability of records or test results. So any kind of deviation or any kind of incident that occurs, perhaps a disaster computer system, you want to make sure that everything is investigated completely and thoroughly and a remedy is applied. The root cause analysis should be done. Whatever changes are made to a computer system, whether that's code changes, hardware changes, anything that's going to make a significant impact on the system functionality, it has to be done according to a formal change control procedure. It should be formally authorized or approved by someone. It should be documented, and the system should be tested before it's put back into production in the altered state. There may be some additional testing if you're adding functionality, new requirements to your system. You would take your development version of the system, make your changes, put it into your test version or your test environment, do the appropriate testing, which should include some regression testing of the original set of validation testing, and then whatever additional testing is required to show the change was made effectively and didn't alter anything else. That should all be done and approved before putting it back into the production environment in the altered state. Any modifications to the system, enhancements, any kind of patch or upgrade, update, change in functionality, anything like that should be evaluated in terms of what's the risk of this change having an impact on the functionality of the system. So when you are evaluating your change, you want to make sure you've taken into account the potential risk, that you've accommodated that using some good mitigation through testing, and that it's all documented. You have to also show the system is maintained in a validated state. So once your system is in production and it's been validated, someone is responsible for maintaining the system in operations. The maintenance of the system should be done such that everything is documented. Any kind of preventive maintenance or scheduled maintenance to the system, any kind of unscheduled maintenance, any kind of data errors or system errors, anything that happens to that system, you need a complete chronology, a complete history of every action related to the system. Your backups, your archival, your disaster recovery planning, everything related to it. That's one of the reasons as well that there are many IT organizations that I encounter in pharmaceutical companies or in medical device companies, any regulated industry. But I come across IT people who don't have any real understanding of computer system validation. They know about software development and testing, and they do think that they're taking all the appropriate steps and procedures to get the system into the right, correct functioning state, but often they don't have that appreciation for computer system validation and the documentation associated with it. They may not even understand how to do good documentation practices in compliance with FDA. In a lot of cases, that's a failing on the organization. Now, with data integrity, there are some important concepts that should be noted. We want to talk about metadata, or data about the data, audit trails that show any kind of change to data, static versus dynamic records, backup data sets, and system validation, which is of utmost importance. Now, metadata is typically a tag that you put on data. It describes attributes of data, provides context and meaning. The audit trails should show the old and new values, who made a change, when they made it, and why they made it. No data should ever be deleted until the end of its retention period. If it's required under retention requirements, then you must maintain that data with integrity. Processing information as well. You want to know exactly what's being analyzed, what kinds of algorithms are being used, how are you getting your results, and methods used for collecting the data and evaluating it. A static data is a fixed record or could be a printout. It's something that's not going to change. The dynamic data is the electronic record a user can interact with and modify. Of course, with dynamic data, you want to have good audit trail capabilities. Your backups, you may have editable data that includes metadata and system configuration settings. You want to know if you have a backup copy of your data, when it was collected, when the backup was made, how it was made, what version of the system was it made with, what were the system configuration settings if it's a configurable system, was the system validated? And system validation should include backup and recovery process, disaster recovery planning. And these are some of the areas as well that FDA will focus on during inspection. If you're excluding CGMP data from decisions, you wouldn't normally do that. If you're not validating your workflow, you're not restricting access to systems, sharing logins and accounts. You're not putting controls in place for blank forms. You're not reviewing audit trails to make sure they are done with integrity. You're not maintaining electronic copies properly or paper printouts properly. You're not handling electronic signatures properly in compliance with 21 CFR Part 11 or your electronic CGMP records. All of these are areas where the FDA finds fault with companies. Now, the FDA expects that the effort and resource assigned to any kind of data governance is based on risk product quality. So, in this respect, when you validate your system, you need to do that risk assessment. When we first talked about an inventory of GXP systems, prioritized by the potential risk, should the system fail, what kind of risk could that pose to a product, process, or a person? You want to make sure that you're assigning the right level of effort and the right resources to making sure that you're doing due diligence in terms of assessing risk, potential risk, and mitigating it. Companies should have an overarching data governance system. There should be a data governance program in place, a data governance board, for example, that has a charter that shows that your systems are maintained with integrity, they're validated and maintained in a validated state, and the data is governed through audit trails, through proper backup and recovery, through proper disaster recovery, and through change control and audit trails. Your data integrity policies and staff training should be developed very strongly. And the adequacy of comparable vendor systems should be verified. So you want to make sure that if you're using systems, you're using them for the right reason, the right application, or for the right job. It's suitable to use of the system. And here are some examples of some findings. Here the FDA found a firm that failed to ensure laboratory records included complete data derived from all tests necessary to ensure compliance with established specifications and standards. Raw data for sample preparation wasn't maintained. Some data was discarded in the trash. These are some of the worst examples of what they can come across. Some companies don't maintain manufacturing and product testing data to the level they should, ensuring that data is attributable to specific people. Every piece of data should be attributed to a specific person who did the activity. They've come across falsification, inaccurate data. Some of it is by accident, some of it's intentional. Failure to complete documentation at the time the activity is done. Not having raw data available. Training file rewritten. In other words, the file is not maintained. There are some new deficiencies identified in the past few years, which is also, I find, unusual since most applications have been protected in some way from having these issues. The manipulation of date and time stamps, making it appear samples were tested at a different time than they actually were reviewed or approved at a different time. Manipulating the date and time stamp can only be done if the application draws the date and time stamp from the desktop or laptop and the user does it, or if it's somebody fooling around with the server date and time stamp. The application should all run against a server that pulls the date and time stamp from meridian time, from a source that is going to reflect actual time. There should never be any changes allowed to a date or time. The new deficiencies are identified by investigators who have been given detailed training in this area, that have learned better to understand GXP computerized systems and their capabilities. So there have been, in the past few years, efforts by the FDA to better train their auditors and inspectors. In this case, a firm failed to exercise appropriate controls over their computerized systems. They didn't ensure that only authorized personnel made changes in a master production and control set of records or other records. That lack of basic controls to prevent changes to electronically stored data is going to cause you to have a finding from FDA. In some cases, they found that there were audit trails associated with the applications, but they were turned off. No one should ever be allowed to or able to turn off or delete an audit trail. There were no controls in place to prevent the substitution, deletion, or overwriting of data. So there was no audit trail, and there was nothing to prevent someone from changing data, whether it was proper or not. And again, the sharing of user names and passwords. Often, companies will have workstations that allow multiple users to share the workstation, for example, in a laboratory area or a manufacturing area. But that person who's using the system should be forced to log in as their own identity, their user ID and their password. And no one should ever be in a system pretending to be another user. That's considered fraud. Here, QC personnel created unauthorized folders on lab computers without the appropriate oversight. So they had folders on their systems that had data and files in them, but there was no oversight to that, no record of why that was being done or what that meant. Again, failure to prevent unauthorized access, someone accessing functionality, changing data that they should never be able to do, or providing adequate controls to prevent the omission of data. In some cases, they found that only the organization only included the most favorable test results, and that was after multiple tests were run, and there was no justification for discounting some of the data. Again, the failure to record activities when they are performed. Never go back and try to fill in, for example, a test protocol that was executed a week ago. You don't go into it today and try to fill it in and then backdate it. Never destroy original records unless they are no longer required based on retention periods. You should always know the retention period for all of your data, and you should always maintain it for that period of time. However, once that period has ended, you would be best to destroy the data, destroy the records, destroy the paper or electronic. You want to make sure that once you are no longer required by FDA to maintain data or records, that they are destroyed to avoid any potential for FDA asking questions they're not entitled to ask. Rough notes are sometimes used. Someone's using an unbound notebook, uncontrolled loose paper, and they're recording, jotting things down in a laboratory or manufacturing area or anywhere. They're capturing original, critical manufacturing data and destroying that after they transcribe it into the actual batch production record. Backdating of production records when personnel were not on site to perform the activity. So the activity might not have occurred on a certain day, and in order to make it look as though it did, they would backdate it, and that's fraud. Now, the Food and Drug Administration developed their guidance for industry and FDA staff. They wanted to have a special one that was about the implementation of a custom device exemption that was part of the FD&C Act. It's about custom medical devices. This is a specific one that relates to one type of product in industry. But it's just an example of the number of types of guidance documents that are out there on the FDA.gov website. There are documents for guidance for pharmaceutical companies, drugs, and use of computer systems for 21 CFR Part 11 electronic records and signatures, medical devices, using software as a medical device or software with a medical device. There are guidance documents coming out all the time, and these should be referred to on the FDA.gov website. Again, this is just one example of many that are out there. So let's talk about what you should do for your IT and automated systems. IT systems typically mean applications, something with functionality for a user. The automated systems tend to be more controlling or monitoring a particular piece of equipment or an action. The IT and automated systems that are used to develop, manufacture, store, distribute, or perform any key operational process related to a GXP product must be considered a GXP system. It touches an FDA-regulated product in some way. It's used to collect, to analyze, report, transmit, or in any way, shape, or form process the FDA-regulated data. It has to be validated in accordance with the FDA's requirements for computer system validation. These are just some of the examples of the systems you'll find in your organization. You have systems in laboratories, clinical operations, room environmental monitoring and animal observation, manufacturing, enterprise systems. But note that the interfaces and the integration of systems is also critical. You never want to have a validated or clean system interfaced or integrated with a system that's not equally validated. You don't want instructions or data coming from a dirty system to your clean, validated system. That computer system validation started up with FDA in 1983 with the Blue Book. Basically, they said that it's the process of assuring a system does what it purports to do, that you've defined those requirements and you've thoroughly tested and validated to prove that every single requirement works. It's based on the System Development Life Cycle methodology, the SDLC. It includes every phase from cradle to grave for a system. And as you can see, it requires rigorous planning, testing, and documentation throughout. So once your system is validated, you still have to ensure the system remains in a validated state. And every time you're making a change to the system under formal change control, you have to plan, assess the risk, do the test planning and the testing, and document everything. All of that before you put it back into production. Any kind of IT or automated system in your organization that's involved in the activities related to your product have to be considered. And resources that are involved in any way with the system have to be concerned about it and trained. So that includes people who possibly you have IT developers in your organization, or IT or business people that are maintaining it in a validated state, your users. And don't forget your quality auditors, who are going to be the ones who are going to look at, reflect internally, look at your computer system validation program as a whole and the actual validation of systems and make sure everything is up to snuff. You also might have a third party involved, contractors, consultants. You might have a service provider that is supporting your system. Even if that's the case, you are responsible as a company for maintaining the system in a validated state. So you want to make sure that any kind of contractor or vendor understands the concepts behind computer system validation and compliance, and that they're well versed in that, and that they're following all of your policies and procedures that relate to validation. Typically, if you're using a vendor, both in the case of an application package that you buy from a vendor or services you buy from a vendor, you want to make sure the vendor is a quality vendor, that they have a good system. If they're making software, they have a good system for software development and maintaining it in a good state, that they understand system promotion or promotion of code into different environments, that they use good change control practices. You can find that out through an audit of the vendor. and that is a best practice. The system development life cycle, you can see it goes in a circle because even once your system is at that maintenance point on the left, you still have changes that will happen, patches or updates or new versions, releases of new code, new functionality. And every time you do those changes, you have to plan them, analyze, design, code, test, and begin maintenance again. It's a never-ending cycle until the system is retired. The SDLC should be used and followed from the time you decide on your system through retirement. Now, with your SDLC, you would start with your validation plan, and that plan would address all of these key elements. You have your functional requirements specification to say what the system is expected to do. Design specification, how that functionality is delivered. The functional requirements are the what, the design is the how. And you also want to make sure that every functional requirement is unique and testable. You also will have other requirements, system performance requirements, maybe security requirements, other types of requirements that relate to the use of the system. You may also have a configuration specification if it's a configurable system. With unique code or custom code, you've got your design specification to go with that. But with a configurable system, that's where you have different parameters that can be set to different values. You can flip switches on and off, turn functionality and features on and off. You need to have a configuration specification that details the configuration of the system right before you're going to test it for validation. And that configuration has to be maintained. All of these documents must be maintained as living documents. If you change the requirements for your system at any point in time, before or after validation, you must go back and update these documents. You may be adding testing, different test scripts if you're making changes and including new functionality or turning functionality on. Your test planning should include the installation qualification, the IQ, the OQ, or operational qualification, and the PQ, or performance qualification, sometimes also called user acceptance testing. You want to make sure that you have a test protocol for each of these, that you execute them, and that you document everything accordingly, and create a summary report at the end. You should also have a validation summary report that details everything you were going to do in your validation plan to say that you did it as planned. Finally, you'll be putting your system in production. Before that, though, you want to make sure the users agree that the system functions as intended. And so a system acceptance document is usually generated that the users can sign on as a contract to say they agree the system does what it purports to do. You'll also have a notification of release by the steward of the system, whether that's someone in the IT organization or an outside service or contractor. You want to have someone who issues a document releasing the system to production on a specific date and time, so that you know that only data collected after that point in time or data generated by the system is allowable after that point in time. Once it's in operational maintenance and support, you need to have all of the operational maintenance logs, all of the procedures, all of the SOPs, everything that's required to document that the system is being maintained in a validated state. So you want to record your preventative maintenance, your unscheduled maintenance, any disasters that happen, how you recover the system, your backup and recovery and archival, and finally your system retirement. But note you also need to have periodic review of every GXP system. So at least annually, or if you make a significant change to the system, you must look at all of the aspects of the system from the time it was first validated until the current time to demonstrate that it has remained in a validated state. So change control laws, any kind of changes that were made, was the system revalidated? Was additional testing done? Was it adequate? Did a risk evaluation get performed to make sure that you were testing appropriately based on the potential risk of the system failing? All of that should be in your periodic review report, documenting that, yes, the system has been maintained for the last year or time period in a validated state. Now, when you're validating your system and you're writing your validation plan, that's where you're going to have a rationale for the level of testing required to prove the system does what it purports to do. One of the things that should be based on is what we find in GAMP-5, Good Automated Manufacturing Practice, which was published by the International Society of Pharmaceutical Engineers, or ISPE. It states that the conditions that a regulated product is exposed to must be accurately recorded to prove that the product was created, processed, and stored within the correct parameters. So basically, your computer system or your manual records must be authentic and must be under good control. The GAMP-5 concepts can improve your existing methodology if you just take a look at them. They're not prescriptive, but they're more or less suggestions that can be used with good judgment. One of the key things about GAMP-5 is the guidance aims to achieve computerized systems fit for intended use and that meet the regulatory requirements. The idea is to build good industry best practices. There's the focus on patient safety, on product quality, and data integrity. There's effective governance to make sure that you're maintaining GXP compliance. It's based on the life cycle approach within a quality management system, and it's scalable, based on risk and complexity. The idea is to improve GXP compliance, efficiency, and effectiveness. Of course, if you have a system and you have to validate it, you want to do it in a cost-effective way and an efficient way, but it must also be an effective way. There should be continuous improvement built in. Again, it's not prescriptive, but it's pragmatic guidance. It offers approaches and tools for the practitioner, but again, you must apply good expertise and judgment. The GAMP-5V model gives you a good way to look at the overall process for validation. As you go down the left-hand side from the top, you start with your validation plan. Now, you may or may not have a user requirement specification. That's typically a very high-level business language type of requirement that the person in the business is going to ask for. I want a system that records data. The functional requirement specification breaks down the user requirements into very detailed functional requirements. The functional requirements are the what the system does. The system design spec or configuration spec is how the system delivers that functionality. You then develop your system, customize it, or configure it. Or you could have a system that's basically out of the box and is not customizable or configurable. Based on that, you want to be able to classify your system, categorize it, and be able to do your validation level of testing that's appropriate. Your IQ has to be done for every bit of hardware and software. You want to make sure you're installing everything properly. Screenshots or a video recording of the process of installing software, for example, should be considered for your documentation. In your operational qualification, you're proving that the core functionality works. The requirements are met. In your performance qualification, you're proving beyond that. It not only does what it's supposed to do, but it doesn't do what it's not supposed to do, the negative scenarios. You're also challenging the boundaries and stress testing. Note as well that the IQ and OQ can be done by anyone. You can buy a package, an IQ and an OQ package from a vendor. They can execute those packages. But the PQ is different. The PQ can be written by someone on the outside of your organization, but it must be with input from your subject matter experts. It also must be executed by your subject matter experts in a way that they're going to use the system in their environment. And finally, your validation summary report, which ties it all together and basically says everything in your plan was done the way you said you would do it. Now, in addition to how your validation plan should have in it information about the system, the size of the system, the complexity, the potential risk associated with it. The risk-based approach is an industry best practice and can help lead to developing the right level of validation testing. FDA again doesn't have adequate staffing, so they expect you to have that GXP list of GXP systems prioritized by risk. You want to use a standard risk approach so that you're evaluating each system consistently. This way you can prioritize them relative to each other. Now, the FDA may look at one or two of your systems, but if they look at your inventory, they might pick 2 from the top 5 or top 10 systems. They may also pick 1 from the bottom. You don't know. So you need to have each one validated appropriately for the level of risk associated with the potential failure of that system. Would it affect a product, a process, or a person, and how would it affect them? So for each system, you want to have a specific rationale. Look at the system and say, if it were to fail, what impact would that have on process or product and potentially on a human? And the system can fail in many different unrelated ways, so you have to consider all of these potential risk scenarios for each system. You do this in your validation planning step. Identify specific risk scenarios. Could be based on a typical lab system process and operation, or if it's a manufacturing system or any other type. You want to assess what's the severity of impact to testing if you were to have this risk happen. Assess the likelihood that this risk is going to happen, the probability. How detectable is the risk? If it happened, would you know automatically because the system would basically stop functioning? Or is it something that's not detectable and you wouldn't know, and you could be getting erroneous results and not even realizing it? Have you identified ways to mitigate each risk? Based on all that, you can determine the priority of addressing each risk and then have an overall risk profile for that particular system. I also want to say one thing about the category of system. In your validation plan, you want to make sure that you use GAMP5 categorization of software. They categorize it as 1 to 5, 1 being a very simple server software, operating system, database software, tools and utilities. Category 2 might be something more complex that has some kind of ability to be calibrated or some kind of controlling mechanism. In category 3, we have off-the-shelf software, and that software is used as is. You can't custom code it or configure it. Category 4 is configurable software, a little bit more complex. And category 5 is custom, and could be custom and configurable. But as you go from 1 to 5, you see the complexity increasing, and so you need to take that into account as you're developing your rationale for the level of testing you're going to do. The FDA will expect you to have that rationale detailed in your validation plan. Again, based on size, complexity, potential risk, GAMP5 category, and basically what could happen if something went wrong with the system. Now we're going to switch gears to regulatory influences. There are a lot of different factors that affect how FDA approaches regulations. and compliance. If there's, for example, some kind of issue with a product that causes death or injury, they're going to be very reactive. Whereas if it's something that is noticed over time, they're going to adapt a little bit better to it in a steadier manner, slower manner. So it depends on what's causing them to either create a regulation or modify one. Often a change is caused by one company that causes everyone in the industry to have to follow suit. So if you have product recalls and complaints and adverse events, manufacturing issues, if someone is misusing a regulated product, if there are compliance issues, all of these can result in some severe damage to people. And as a result of that, the company is going to pay a price. But unfortunately, FDA is not going to simply put the regulation or strengthen the regulation just for that company. They're going to look at everybody in that industry, and they're going to do the same. There are many factors that affect how FDA is looking at companies, their approach to compliance. They look at technology changes, product and breakthrough changes, new changing diseases and conditions. And then you have things like the economy, politics, society, and media, historical events, and global pressure. All of these have influenced the FDA in recent years and continue to do so. Now with technology, with computer systems, you're dealing now with cloud technology and hosting services. You want to make sure that if you're using a cloud service provider that you have a reputable vendor. Somebody like Amazon Web Services, where you can go on the internet and get documentation to show that they have good practices for how they maintain their systems. You also could have wireless communications and handheld devices being used. Here, security issues are something you have to consider. Mobile applications, physical security, hacking, all those things. And then there are things like telemedicine, telemonitoring, logistical controls around mobile medical devices, and biometrics, and other types of security measures that are more commonly used today than they were 20 years ago. All of these things are going to influence how the FDA is looking at your ability to secure your systems and ensure the integrity of your data. Also, data warehouses, analytics, reporting, encryption, cyber defense, web-based applications. It's hard for FDA inspectors and auditors to keep up with all of the technology changes because the systems are changing constantly. So you may get an inspector who doesn't understand the technology you're using adequately. Also, the globalization of industries put more pressure on FDA. They have to fast-track products because of the extensive span of the application and benefit to mankind. There's also a proliferation from companies of me-too products. That challenges FDA's resources. They have to do audits and inspections for all of these products. We had the recent example of the Ebola virus, measles outbreak, and the FDA can become very reactive to these types of events. And a lot of times they believe they had too little scrutiny used in the past, and they're going to strengthen their oversight. The U.S. economy as well is going to have an effect, because how many auditors are you going to be able to hire? How many agents? Companies have larger profits. They can do more lobbying of Congress to reduce regulations. There are many healthcare industry changes, consolidations, mergers, affecting the purchase and the cost of products that are out there in the marketplace. Also, as insurance costs and availability change, so too will regulations that might add cost to each product based on the cost of research, production, and distribution. All of these economic factors will have some influence on how the FDA is looking at industry. And politics. Again, we have lobbying. Right now we have a conservative Congress and administration. So more bills may be passed, but the Affordable Health Care Act is still in place. The FDA 510K process for medical device design control is focused on risk-based processes. There's also, with medical devices, unique device identifications, the UDI. All of these types of regulations have come out in recent years to align with some of the outcome of what's going on in the world. Now, the balance of power between industry and the FDA continues to change and swing back and forth. It does so based on a lot of things, including politics. Where you have wars, you have an industry that's trying to provide more breakthrough technologies. You have FDA trying to ensure that these are safer. They have to weigh the risk, the patient's benefit to the patient versus the potential risk to the patient. Society also has influence, where you have more social media, you have more public opinion about different things that are related to regulatory requirements. You have more baby boomers aging, so you're going to have to meet a larger population demand of consumers with demand. And again, with different outbreaks, you're stimulating the FDA's appetite for regulation. You also have increased consumer advocacy, especially fired up by a lot of social media. So there's constant activity, there's constant reactivity. And the media capitalizes on epidemics and outbreaks. It's a great story. The market share raises a lot of public distrust, though, and pressure on the government. It also makes people more aware of illness, and they can consider that to be something that could happen to them, and they're going to demand some more stronger rules and stronger regulations. The explosion in real-time communication and 24/7 news cycles added fuel to all of this fire. Now, one of the most widely known events was 1970s when Tylenol, someone tried poisoning people through putting contaminating Tylenol pills. That occurrence caused the FDA to swing back and hit industry very hard. Now, recalls have not been extremely widespread or extremely deadly or constantly in the news or public eye, but if they do become that way, those historical events can shift how the FDA is going to face regulation. And global pressure. Now we have companies trying to manufacture and sell products globally. FDA has to extend its purview and visit other countries at a higher cost. Also expanding their work efforts causes usable resources. You have emerging markets. China, Brazil, and Mexico are huge in terms of healthcare and pharmaceuticals. So is India. And a lot of global challenges as well, where you have trade and other barriers. You have tariffs, preferential treatment. You might also have concerns about supply chain with contraband and counterfeit. Companies have to be agile and flexible to respond to all of this. And this is just a list of the many sources where you can look for trends that could affect FDA thinking. But again, you want a good relationship with your FDA partner, your FDA local office. You want to be able to ask questions and not risk having them scrutinize you more heavily as a result. Discuss trends with them. When you have a regulatory change, look at your validation program and your strategy, policies, procedures, business processes, your individual systems that are validated, training, your organization and governance of data. Look at all these things and determine what kind of impact a regulatory change is going to have and whether or not you need to tweak one of these or any of these or all of these. And also have a good validation program and strategy in place. Do that good risk assessment and have a good implementation strategy built out in your validation plan. You want to make sure that you also have business continuity and disaster recovery in place, and you have an ongoing strategy for maintaining your system in a validated state. Your policies and procedures. The policy is the what the organization expects you to do, and the procedures are how. You should have all of the policies and procedures related to validation in place, detailing steps for how you go about doing the validation process. And as things change with regulations, do a gap analysis, plan any changes, and take action. Your individual validated systems. You may have to do something in terms of additional testing to make sure you're addressing any concern FDA may have. And there's an impact on training. You want to make sure training is kept up, that people understand new regulations that are coming out and how they might affect your particular systems and your validation components, your program, your data governance program. You want to use worst-case scenarios and challenge employees to come up with ideas for how they can improve. And provide industry best practices and case studies to them. Let them understand exactly how the training plays into their day-to-day operations and how important it is. Also understand who's going to be affected in your organization by any changes. Who are the early adapters to change, and who are the ones who are going to be lagging behind or actually obstructing. Make sure stakeholders understand what changes are coming and how to adapt to them. Have that good governance program in place. Make sure people are trained in understanding the importance of it and the aspects of governance that must be in place to keep your data in a state of integrity. And always have a documented plan of action. So if you find that you have some deficiencies, make sure you put together a plan for remediating that, because a plan will take you a long way with FDA if they come in for an inspection. If you have a plan in place with a timetable, resources assigned, you're in a much better, much stronger position for addressing the issue. So the best practices. You need a good corporate culture that encourages being able to report mistakes without retaliation. Also, trust that this initiative on regulators' part is here to stay. The regulatory authorities must be able to trust the data that you generate. Understand, read and understand the intent and application of any guidance or regulations. Monitor what's going on in enforcement. Look at 483s, warning letters, and so forth. You want to make sure you understand the basis for these and where FDA is finding things and hitting the hardest. Look at your systems accordingly. Remember, data integrity is for paper and for electronic records, or hybrid systems where you have both. And don't relegate compliance of GXP computer systems to just your IT department if they're the ones who are stewards of the system. They might have technical expertise, but you have to be sure that they are trained in GMP or GXP requirements. It's a partnership. Have that data governance program in place with a process. Data is one of your most valuable corporate assets. And data and process flows should be mapped for systems, showing where the data is being input and output, understanding it. Validate every system based on its intended purpose. Don't purchase a system that some vendor tells you is either validated or FDA compliant or 21 CFR 11 compliant. You need to do the work to make sure it is. Make sure you understand the controls that you can put in place. Some of them are just temporary until you can put a full, complete remediation in place. Senior management, your corporate culture, your users who are making the business decisions. All of them have to be appropriately trained and understand what's going on with these systems. Internal audits need to be done. Newer technologies need to be considered, but also look at what regulations are coming out against them. Stay ahead of the curve and make sure everything is documented appropriately. So we've covered a lot of material, but basically changes can be derived from many sources that can impact your ability to be an operational company, stay on top of trends and emerging technologies. Always look at your validation strategy, your policies and procedures, and your systems. Make sure that you update these or remediate these as needed. Have the right training in place. Make sure that you look at industry examples of citations and document any lessons learned and best practices. Incorporate them in your training. Change is always going to be constant, so you need to be flexible, adaptable, and ready.